All right, thank you everybody for joining. I was called up a couple of days ago saying you need to present at an API conference for developers. I'm not a developer. I've never done development in my life. However, I've done security and I've done identity for almost 20 years. And one thing that I've noticed right now is that the biggest attack vector outside of social engineering is APIs that you can exploit. So we're going to dig into that a little bit today. We're going to look at how do you actually find these APIs? What can you do to track these? And what can you do about it? And also, how can potentially Okta help out in this? So an overwhelming majority of all the traffic on the internet today, 83%, is API driven. That means that normal HTTP traffic, it's a fraction, right? Everything that we're doing, from Netflix to Pornhub to Miro to whatever it is, it's all back-ended by APIs and API calls and API traffic. That means that opens up a massive, massive attack vector that if you can exploit these APIs as a hacker, as a bad guy, you're pretty much in, right? You have a nice way in where you can access information, you can potentially extract personal identifiable data and put companies at risk, right? Massive, massive risk. And looking at most enterprises, at least the ones that I've interacted with, and this figure here is obviously from some analysts that have done some research, most companies today have an API strategy. They're trying to build out APIs as a product or using the APIs to provide services to partners internally or externally. So it's a huge thing, massive, massive thing. Way back a couple of years ago, Gartner did predict that the APIs will be a very, very big vector when it comes to attacking. So what is a zombie API? This talk is about zombie APIs. We have different terms, right? We have shadow APIs, we have zombie APIs, we got rogue APIs and all that stuff. I just picked zombie APIs. And the reason for that is I thought it sounded cool, right? I was thinking a slide deck with some nice zombies and all the rest. But in reality, what is a zombie API? Well, it is actually an API that an organization have sanctioned, they've approved it, they built it out, they launched it. But over time, that API got forgotten. But it's still lingering around. It's still there. And what is dangerous with that? I mean, we launched it into production. It's available to our partners. The partners are probably using it. We told them to use version 2, but probably they're using version 1. And version 1 might have issues. And that's where the problem is. We have these lurking zombies in our application infrastructure where the potential of leveraging these APIs as a bad guy, right? I'm assuming the red teaming or the bad guy lens here is massive. And how do we get to the bottom of that? Because a lot of the talks, and I've tuned into a couple before this talk, they're talking about API management, they're talking about governance, but part of that governance and API management, they do not mention how do we kill off these zombies, right? We need a shotgun and make sure that that's part of the governance plan to shoot them down dead. That's what we need to do, right? Because these are dangerous. These are absolutely dangerous. They open up and exposing your enterprise to attackers that can leverage these holes because, I mean, I'm not a developer, but you guys are developers. We're not perfect. We put in flaws in our code. We take some shortcuts. We cut some corners. And there's problems with these APIs. So they do pose a significant threat vector, and we need to get to the bottom of that. All right, so we pull up the 12-gauge shotgun, and we try to kill them off. But it's not that easy. And why is that? Well, these APIs, we've kind of posted them publicly. We got partners and customers that are using them. Maybe we even use them internally. And even if we do have I was about to say some French words, our stuff together, they might still be lingering around in a UAT environment somewhere around. Accessible. If you manage to penetrate, you can easily access that stuff. So removing them might have an impact on your business. So it might be an associated cost. You know, the phone will ring. It'll be bad, right? So that's why we kind of leave them there. We don't really know what they're doing. We kind of have an idea, and then we forget about them. And that's so dangerous. That is absolutely so dangerous, which is why when we're implementing and posting APIs, we need to take this into consideration and not an afterthought. So when we have APIs that we're posting publicly, we need to make sure that we have a funeral date. We're going to kill them off, and we're going to have a proper burial. That is very, very important. And obviously, these APIs, if you forget about them, you know, if you lose your keys and you start looking around for the keys, it's kind of tricky to find them. You have no clue where they are, right? Same thing with these guys. Zombie APIs, how do you find them? It's not like you know, they're forgotten, right? They're still there somewhere. And when I was doing some research for this, I came across, there's so many tools out there. I came across something that I found kind of nifty. I fueled up my Kali Linux, and I tried to, you know, figure out this stuff. And there's a solution called Kite Runner. Basically allows you to use word list to iterate, brute force typical API paths, and find these buggers. And there's, of course, a lot of players out there that provide solutions to this. But having those solutions in place is absolutely critical. You need to be able to constantly monitoring for these zombie APIs or shadow APIs or rogue APIs. And you need to make sure that as soon as they are discovered, you do something about it right away. And, you know, API breaches. This is just some random things that have happened over the course of 1 or 2 years. There's a lot of breaches, and they're all done through APIs. Developers that are stressed, they have a delivery, the CTO is banging their head saying, you need to get this out there, wherever it takes. So they cut some corners, and obviously they implement some problems, and these problems are being discovered. Because the normal pen tests that are being done by companies, they don't necessarily find these problems. That's a huge thing, right? And I think Chuck here can vouch for that. It is a huge thing, and you really need that deep penetration testing to be able to find these. And it's not done by some automated tool. It requires a bit of brain power to figure this out. But as you can see on all these headlines, it's a massive problem, right? Massive, massive problem. A lot of data has been leaked, and you can find that, you know, up for sale on various auction sites on the dark web. So there's a couple of typical problems here, and they're all identified by OWASP, who typically list, every year they do an updated list of typical problems when it comes to web development, API development, and all the rest. And a lot of players, and this is where my Okta background comes in, we see companies that insist on building out their own identity layers. They implement authentication, they implement authorization, and they, again, I was about to say something in French, but they mess up, right? And this is a problem. So the second thing is that they have these very sophisticated, complicated authorization models, you know, RBAC, groups, hierarchies. The more complicated it is, the more likely you will mess up. Simple as that. The more complex hierarchies you have for your authorizations, the more likely you will mess up. So these are the typical 2 problems that you'll find when it comes to APIs or any public application that are using APIs. So, I mean, obviously we're trying to survive this zombie apocalypse here. We got a shotgun, we're setting the funeral dates, but we need to find these buggers, right? All of a sudden they keep lurking around, we get caught by surprise. How do we find these? I mean, I mentioned a tool that, I think is part of most red teamers or bad guys, the Kite Runner. It allows you to identify these APIs that you forgot about. But obviously, when something goes down, your blue team needs to be ready, and they need to look at the right things. And I've listed 3 types of things here that they could potentially look at. The database connections. All of a sudden, there's a spike in that. There's a spike in post-authentication services. And there's a lot of stress on the back-end databases. Stuff happens. If you have the right monitoring tools in place, you can detect this as a blue teamer. It all signals problem is happening as we're speaking. There's zombies outside the door, and they're not knocking. They're pulling down the door. So that's one thing I want to highlight. You need to make sure that you have the right monitoring tools in place to be able to detect these. Because if you don't have the governance structure, which, that's my second point, you need the right governance structure. But if you don't have the right monitoring, when problems happens, you want to be able to detect it and do something about it. And it's not only the zombie APIs. I mean, it can be the version 2 API that you posted and you pen tested and you made sure that we have everything under control. Even the governance model says that it's going to die a year from now when we release version 3. Even if you've done everything in your power, there can still be issues with your published APIs that can be exploited. And it's important for the blue teamer to be able to monitor this and detect it. So make sure that you have the right monitoring tools in place in your SOC or in your company. So OWASP said that there's a lot of companies, and I come across these every day. There's a lot of companies that are trying to build out their own identity systems. They're building an identity layer, and they mess up. Because why? It is hard. It's tricky, right? You guys as developer are under massive stress. You need to crank out innovations, and you cut corners because you have a deadline, and you need to make sure that you deliver, right? It's all deadline driven. And this day and age, everything is agile, everything is sprints, and we need to make sure that we crank something out before the end of the sprint. And, down the line, we kind of cut some corners. So identity is hard, right? Why is it hard? Think about it. We have, for example, just dealing with passwords. How do we deal with passwords? How do we deal with complexity? How do we reset a password that we've forgotten if we're using passwords? Now, obviously, we as Okta, we don't want you guys to use passwords. We want you to use passwordless approaches, integrate with social IDPs, or use other types of solutions to tackle this. And then you have the scalability. And then you have, behavioral aspects to it. What if I log in from, let's pick a random country, Botswana, all of a sudden. I'm in the wrong time zone. I'm logging in from Botswana. Is that okay? Am I supposed to do that? Am I supposed to get access? Then you need to think about the whole behavioral MFA aspect. So step up the security, step up the authentication to introduce a second factor, just to make sure that you can validate that I am who I claim to be. So these things are very, very complicated. And that's why you should really avoid to build that out yourselves, because it is one of the top reasons why there's problems introduced in APIs that you publish and you build. So what we're suggesting here, and obviously Okta doesn't cover everything when it comes to the whole governance and life cycles of APIs. There's a lot of partners of ours that are doing that outside there. But we do have API access management, which is a good solution, right? It's a good way of approaching and introducing a better security to your APIs. If we look at consumer-facing APIs, we should really look at an identity layer from, preferably us, but there's a lot of vendors that does this for a living. They do not cut the corners when it comes to implementing the identity layers, which is most likely that you guys will do when you're under heavy pressure and you need to deliver. I'm not going to go into too much details about our solution. You'll be more than happy to come by our booth and talk about API access management or customer-facing identity or workforce-related. But there are benefits, and those benefits allow you to avoid these traps of introducing problems in your APIs. Because now we know APIs, API-driven traffic is the #1 chunk of traffic on the internet. It's a huge, huge vector of attack surface. And we don't want to publish APIs that contains these problems. We'd rather put that out, outsource that to someone else that does this for a living. So let's summarize. Most traffic on the internet is today API driven. Whether you're watching a movie or something you shouldn't watch, or you're playing with Miro and some other stuff out there, it's all API driven. Zombie APIs are APIs that you kind of forgot about, and they're still lingering around, they're lurking around, and they will at some point sneak up on you and do you dirty. And in order to avoid that, two things, right? One, you need to ensure that your blue team, your SOC, or your security analyst have the right monitoring tools in place to check for these problems before they make an impact, before they sneak up on you and club you in the head. Second, do not think that you can build identity by yourself. It's a waste of your time, and you should focus your time on innovating and building that application that your company has put you in place to do. So do not build identity yourself. Make sure that you get something off the shelf that does this for a living, because it's a hard work. There's a lot of standards to keep up, and there's a lot of changes occurring. And then when it comes to the whole governance, make sure that your governance model actually includes a funeral date. Make sure that we put that guy to rest, that API to rest, and we kill it off completely. And that could be a hard decision. Why is that a hard decision? Well, it's because that API may still be used. So part of the whole governance process, we need to make sure that we communicate with all our partners, all our customers, to make sure that they don't use this stuff. Move to the new one. You have 1 month. So be sure that you implement that as part of your governance process and get rid of those zombie APIs.